who is a Senior Program Associate at Population Action International, PAI. And then we have Abigail Jones, who's the Director of Research and Policy at Climate Advisors. A note about today's meeting, it is being webcasted live, and so when we do come to the discussion portion, I will ask that those that have a question use a mic, and please do use them so that folks that are tuning in will be able to hear you. So we are now going to turn it over to Clive first, who will then be followed by Elia, and then Abigail. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, we are so excited to be here today. Thank you so much. Okay. Yeah, we thank the Wilson Center for International Scholars for organizing this event. We are looking forward to the discussion of the study that we are presenting the results here today. Just to mention that this is part of our research collaboration that we undertook with the African Institute for Development Policy, which is based in Nairobi. And Dr. Leah Zulu is the executive director. He is going to talk more about the organization itself. My name is Clive Mutunga, as Sandeep mentioned. I'm a senior research associate at Population Action International, which is a few blocks from here. My portfolio mostly involves working on our climate program. So that's why I spend most of the time trying to understand the links between population issues as they relate to climate change and development and broader issues of sustainable development. So the outline of the presentation today is that I'll talk about the study, talk about the objectives, methodology, and some of the outputs. Then I'll go deeper into the findings. Under the findings, I'll look at the links between population, climate change, and development in sub-Saharan Africa, Malawi, and Kenya. And then Dr. Leah Zulu will talk about policy assessments in Malawi and Kenya and wrap up with the policy and program implications. And then Abigail will lead in a discussion. So this study had a number of objectives. Basically, it was to kind of demonstrate how the relationships between climate change effects, demographic trends, and reproductive health are likely to affect countries' ability to adapt to the effects of climate change in Africa. And then, based on that analysis, then we went deeper to look at two countries in Africa, Kenya and Malawi, to identify policy and program opportunities for incorporating population considerations into their climate change development strategies. So this one we did through conducting policy and program landscape assessments in both countries. We did conduct a number of field interviews with the key informants, and I'll mention that in the methodology. And then the last objective we wanted to specifically relate our study to was to kind of to promote the use of research evidence on promoting links between population and climate change in climate-compatible development planning and programming at national levels and regional levels in Africa. One of the things you'll notice is that there's not much of there isn't a lot that has been done in terms of evidence of the links specifically for Africa and more so for the country level. So this was a deliberate objective of the study. So in terms of methodology, we did some analysis of demographic, climate change, and environment data, getting the data sets that we normally use from the UN Population Division, doing some projections on population projections on a number of climate change variables and environment, especially water resources, agricultural production, deforestation, and other socioeconomic variables. We also complemented this with our desk review of literature. We went through a number of policy documents that have been done by these countries, some of them under development and some of them are already developed. And then we did in-depth interviews, talking to key policymakers in the countries, in the Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Planning and National Development, and others. And we also spoke with the representatives of development organizations like the major donor agencies like the UNDP, UNEP, and a host of others, as well as civil society organizations like the climate change working groups in the two countries. So out of this research collaboration, we've been able to produce a number of outputs. There are three full reports. One is the African Regional Report, a country report for Malawi, and a country report for Kenya. And each of these reports have a policy-friendly policy and issue brief, which summarizes the key issues in each of the big reports. And we got some copies from on the desk out there. Please feel free to have a copy or two. So kind of now going into the main presentation, we wanted to get started with the issue of sustainable development. And as most of you know, the sustainable development has been defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That definition kind of brings out an intergenerational aspect. And that's why population dynamics are so important. And we wanted to show that investing in sustainable development will help addressing issues of population dynamics, will address the three pillars of sustainable development, which has been formulated in this famous framework by the United Nations, which has three pillars: the social pillar, the economic, and the environment pillar. In this framework, population dynamics is found within the social sector pillar, but we hope to demonstrate that population dynamics not only should be in the social sector, the social pillar of sustainable development, rather than it should be integrated within all the three pillars. So we started looking at some of the demographic data, and to kind of get started, we looked at population projections in sub-Saharan Africa, and we get some three key messages that the population, the three key issues in Africa: the population is growing, the structure is growing, and there are several structural elements like urbanization. Sub-Saharan Africa is home to about 800 billion, and this number is projected to increase to 2.1 billion by the year 2050. There are 31 countries whose population is projected to at least double by the year 2050. The population growth is mostly as a result of high fertility. Approximately, most women will have five children in the continent, as compared to the global average of 2.4. And another characteristic of the population in Africa is that it's mostly made up of young people, around 43% in general, but slightly higher in other countries. And then another key aspect, which is an interest of ours, is high unmet need for family planning. More than 20% of these countries, women living in these countries, have unmet need for family planning, in the sense that they would want to postpone permanently or temporarily childbearing, but they are not using any modern method of contraception. So I mentioned one of the key features is urbanization, and this graph might look kind of cluttered, but there are two or three key messages that it is showing. Number one, it shows that out of the projected population, majority of that population will be residing in urban areas in Africa. The big circles show the share of urban population out of the total population. So you can see big circles around West Africa, some cities in North Africa like Cairo, and all the way in East and Central Africa, including South Africa. But there are also the red segment of the circles, which shows the share of urban population living in slums. This is not just an issue of population numbers or urban population numbers, but issues of poverty. Who are the people who are going to be living in the urban areas? So you can look at some countries, some cities in West Africa, more than half of the population living in urban slums or informal settlements. So these ones have very important implications for socioeconomic development, because it matters in terms of a provision of basic services like education, like health facilities, like schools, and all those services. Then we want to look at issues of population growth as it relates to agricultural production, which, as you know, that majority of the population in Africa is supported by agricultural activities, mostly rain-fed agriculture. And we kind of did, the analysis was just to identify countries that have rapid population growth and overlay them with countries that are projected to have an agricultural production decline because of climate change. So the countries in red show the ones that have the highest projected decline to some levels up to 8%. Then the gold background shows a medium kind of a decline, projected decline in agricultural production. So the point here is that most of the African countries are projected to decrease agricultural production, and then the dual challenges of rapid population growth and climate change are likely to compound issues of food security. We did the same for water stress and scarcity, trying to look at the available water resources in each of these countries and overlay with population growth in these countries. And one picture is clear that the region is to be affected severely by water scarcity. We don't have, one of the issue about precipitation data from the models is that it's so unclear, but the data that has been provided by this by organizations like Season at the Columbia University show that a number of countries are going to suffer from water stress or scarcity, and 15 of them in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a combination of water stress and scarcity and high population growth rates. When I talk about water stress and scarcity, it's just based on a measure that was developed by an hydrologist based on the availability, the per capita availability of fresh water in a country. It's really, and of course we know that there are several aspects of access like distribution and others, but we did not pay, that was not the focus of the study. So we also look at climate change resilience. We know that a number of these countries in Africa who have the least to do with climate change in terms of emissions, but they are the most vulnerable, and they are the ones that have the least capacity to deal with the effects of climate change. And one of the things that is weaving around all the maps is that they might look like countries, but even within these countries, there are specific groups that are more vulnerable than others. For instance, women and children are the ones who have to bear the brunt of climate change effects, given their role in the household and how they closely interact with the natural resources. So this study comes up with the population and climate change hotspots, which we refer to as countries of high population growth, high projected decline in agricultural production, and low resilience to climate change. 15 of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. 4 of them are also experiencing water scarcity. And of course, all these countries still are challenged by the traditional development issues like widespread poverty, low education levels, limited health infrastructure, and of course, high levels of gender inequality. Then we kind of, out of the hotspots, we come up with the countries that have a high unmet need for family planning. Over 20% or 1 in 5 women who would like to postpone childbearing, but they are not using any modern method of contraception. So based on the regional analysis, we went deeper to look at countries because the regional outlook is very great, but there are certain inherent characteristics within these countries which might not come out as clearly when you're looking at the global, at the regional level. So we chose 2 countries, Malawi and Kenya, to kind of dig deep and see if the links are still valid. And for instance, Malawi is one of the 15 hotspots that I talked about. It has high population growth rate, high projected decline in agricultural production, and it's one of the least resilient countries to climate change. In addition, it also faces water scarcity. And the population of Malawi is going to grow to around 50 million in 2050. And as I mentioned, for most of the countries in Africa, this growth will be because of high fertility. Malawi has made some good progress in terms of reducing fertility. Right now, the total fertility is 5.8, about 6 children per woman in 2010. Like I mentioned, there's a big youthful population, which means that the child dependency ratio is very high. And one of the features too, which is cutting across all these countries, is that the inherent population momentum issues as well, because the fertility might not be coming down as it is expected to come down, and even if these countries were able to attain replacement fertility level, let's say by 2010 or 2015, the population will continue growing because of the youth bulge. So these are very pertinent issues to consider for socioeconomic development. Then we look at issues of family size and contraceptive use in Malawi. One of the things which is striking across the continent is that there's increasing demand for smaller families. Women would like to have fewer children than their mothers and their grandmothers. The good thing is that you are seeing traction in a number of these countries. In a number of these countries, like the percentage of the CPR has increased from that 10% in 1992 to 46% to 46% in 2010. But there's a striking feature in Malawi in the sense that despite this impressive increase in CPR in the use of contraception, there is relatively slow decline in fertility. So that is something that is intriguing, and probably as part of the discussion, Elia will shed light more on that. Unmet need for family planning is still high. 26% women who are married, not using modern methods of contraception, but willing to postpone, having the need to postpone childbearing. Then we look at urbanization issues in Malawi, and it's a similar pattern that's evident in most other countries. These two graphs there are two messages that you should take away from them. The yellow, the panel on the left, the yellow gold color is the total urban population, and then the red is the rural population, and then the line shows the rural proportion of total population. So just to show you that more Malawians will live in urban areas, which presents new challenges for sustainable development. And also, like I mentioned, it's not just about living in urban areas. You look at the living conditions of these people. The number of people living in urban poverty is increasing rapidly in Malawi. About 65% living in poverty. Then we look at issues of agricultural production. And like I mentioned, about 80% of Malawi's people rely on subsistence agriculture for their livelihoods. And of course, because of climate change, there have been erratic rainfall and droughts, which have led to food shortages and hunger in the past few years. Irrigation is not very widespread because less than 3% of the country's arable land is currently under irrigation. And of course, one of the things that you want to look at is the population density. Currently at 126 people per square kilometer. In the panel to the left, the one to the right is projected by 2030. And you can see more areas, especially the southern area of Malawi, will have more than 400 people per square kilometer. So population density is going to increase, in some cases, more than 6 times, which, of course, has the challenges of land fragmentation and inherent issues of our land productivity. Hence, food security will be compromised. We also look at water in Malawi. Malawi is water scarce. It has the big lake stretching from the north to the south. But of course, despite that big water source, there's limited access of water resources in many of the densely populated districts that I showed you in the south, like Lower Shire Valley. The major source of electricity is hydro, and this is being impacted a lot in terms of power generation, and kind of slows down the economy because it makes number of countries and cities, less attractive for investment. And of course, issues like fish production, which is a food security component as well, are becoming more severe. Then deforestation. Deforestation is also a key issue. The national rate is 2.8% loss of forest, but you find that this varies widely across the 3 regions in Malawi, mostly because of population growth and other factors. Most of the households depend on wood fuel for cooking and heating, 95%, which is pretty high. So those are some of the issues that are coming into play as it relates to climate change and deforestation. Then I briefly look at Kenya before handing it over to Elia. Kenya is the same. Kenya is also characterized by a rapid growing population. It has issues of water scarcity, falling food production, which has been, especially on the northeastern part of the country. The recent drought at the Horn of Africa also affected parts of Kenya. And just to look at the population dynamics, especially population growth, the population is around 40 million, but it is expected to reach 94 million by 2050 and more than 160 million by 2100. Again, this is the population growth. High population growth in Kenya is driven by past fertility. At some point, Kenya had the highest fertility rate in the world at 8.1 children per woman. But this one has increased modestly to 4.6 in 2008. Like Malawi, the population is predominantly young, about 42% of the population below the age of 15. Same story as Malawi. As the Kenya's urban population continues to grow, so does the population living in urban slums. So Kenya is one of the most rapidly urbanizing countries in Africa. More Kenyans moving from the rural areas because the urbanization is caused mostly by rural urban migration moving into the big cities like Nairobi, Mombasa, and the others, presenting new challenges and opportunities for sustainable development. More than half of the urban residents living in informal settlements. I mean, I know most of you know the biggest informal settlement in Eastern and Southern Africa is in Nairobi. The number of people living in urban poverty is increasing in Nairobi, but the total number is increasing, although the proportion of people living in urban areas in Kenya is decreasing, but the total number of people is increasing. So people might say Kenya is doing great because the proportion of people living in urban areas is falling, but the story is that the total number of people living in urban slums is increasing. We look at family size and contraception. We noticed that Kenya was like a pioneer in Africa, alongside countries like Zimbabwe and Botswana, in increasing contraceptive use in sub-Saharan Africa. The percent of women using family planning, modern methods of family planning, rose from 7% and further to that 9% in 1998. But Kenya, like a store in fertility between 1998 and 2003. And the average number of births declined by 2, from 6.7 to 4.7 between 1989 and 98. So unmet need for Kenya, like Malawi, is still high. It's 26%. Good thing is that, like Malawi, Kenya has a renewed interest in family planning. There was a National Leaders Family Planning Conference, which kind of elevated back the issue of family planning again to the national development agenda, and the government is spearheading nice policies and programs to increase contraceptive use in the country. We look at issues of agricultural production again in Kenya. Same as Malawi, majority of the people depending on rain-fed small-scale agriculture for their livelihoods. Climate change effects leading to current droughts that has made big losses to livestock, poor harvests, and food shortages in many areas. one key thing in the Kenyan agriculture is the high level of land fragmentation, which is evident in most of the high population density areas in central Kenya, in western Kenya, and also in the Rift Valley, which are the bread baskets of the country. So increasing population means there could be further land fragmentation, which ultimately affects the productivity of the land. And then we also look at water resources. We know that Kenya is also a water scarce country. Demands for fresh water exceed the supply of fresh water. Recurring droughts, some of them caused by effects of climate change, making things worse, making many rivers seasonal, affecting production of hydroelectric power, which is needed for the country's economic development. And another characteristics of Kenya is that although the proportion of people using safe water is characterized by the United Nations and others, a safe source of drinking water has increased, it still lags behind the international standards. So it's good that the country is making strides in providing safe drinking water to their citizens, but it is still below the international standards. Then we look at deforestation again. To same case as Malawi, there's high dependence on wood for cooking, which leads to cutting of forest, expansion of farmland, urbanization, creating opportunities for urbanization means in some cases cutting down forests. And like Malawi, 90% of households using fuel wood for cooking and eating, and also charcoal. So I kind of rushed through to be able to give earlier time to give you the flavor of the policy assessments, but I just wanted to summarize my talk with 3 key points. Number 1 is that population growth will continue to influence development challenges in Africa, as we saw at the regional level and for both Kenya and Malawi. Climate change is likely to compound the challenges, as it could potentially affect the availability of natural resources such as agricultural land, water, and forest resources. But then, given these 2 issues, how well is population issues and issues to do with family planning and reproductive health integrated into national policies and programs that address climate change and sustainable development? So with that, that's where I hand over to Elia to talk about the second phase of our study, which was on the policy assessments. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, thanks, Clive, and good afternoon, everybody. Let me just start off by saying one thing about the organization that I work for, AFIDEP. It's the African Institute for Development Policy, and our purpose is to promote use of research evidence in decision-making processes. So we synthesize research evidence, translate it, repackage it, and make sure that the evidence that policymakers need to help them make decisions on priority setting, on resource allocation, as well as in terms of on designing or implementing effective programs, that it actually reaches them and they are able to use it. So we're very, very happy to partner with the Population Action International in implementing this project. I should also maybe note that when we're talking about population dynamics, I mean, there are 3 main components to that. There's the issue about population growth. There's the issue about the structure of the population, the changes that change the age structure and so on. And Clive talked about the youthful structure of the African populations, looking at Malawi and Kenya. And we know that that's going to be changing as fertility declines. So what are going to be the implications for development, and as well as implications for the relationship between population and the environment? Those are some of the issues that are covered in the reports. And the third issue is the distribution of the population, which we are mostly looking at from the perspective of urbanization. So what we wanted to do in the policy assessments was basically to say, okay, you look at the analysis that we did at regional level, they are showing that there's these relationships. by no means are these, causal or whatever. We're just looking at relationships. Which areas are most vulnerable to climate change? How is that linked to, to the population characteristics of these areas, and so on? And trying to see whether based on that, you can start, identifying opportunities where addressing population might also help in building resilience to climate change and that sort of stuff. So that's what we're doing in this study. But having looked at the results that Clive presented, our next question was, it looks like population and climate change are so closely linked in Africa that there are already countries that are, experiencing very, very hard, they are highly vulnerable, experiencing hardships due to rapid population growth and so on. Case in point would be countries like Rwanda, one of the most densely populated countries in Africa. Even Malawi, the country we are looking at here, one of the most densely populated countries. And people are feeling the effects of population growth already. In the 70s, in the 80s, it used to act like, a theoretical thing to talk about, what would happen when your population grows rapidly. But people are having small land sizes. People are not able to survive. And now, on top of that, you're having a situation where climate change is destabilizing people's livelihood basis. Climate change is coming in to make their lives even, much more sort of vulnerable. So we wanted to understand if climate change on its own has these effects, and our population is already an issue of concern, increasingly so in many African countries, including these two countries, to what extent are the policies in these countries actually addressing these issues from, an integrated approach? Are they even looking at, integrating them, or are they just being formulated, in a vertical manner? So these are the three issues we're looking at. To what extent are population and climate change issues prioritized? Because they seem to be very, very critical issues. You look at Malawi, 80% of the people depending on smallholder agriculture. Climate change affecting that very, very, adversely. And then it's also the population is growing so rapidly. One wanted to find out to what extent are these issues prioritized in development planning in these countries, and how well are the policies actually integrating these linked challenges. And finally, I'll just talk about what are the policy and program implications. So as a way of actually summarizing what we got from the policy environment assessments, we noted from reading the policies, reviewing the policies, and talking to various stakeholders there, that rapid population growth is really seen as one of the main barriers to economic development. This is a contentious issue. I mean, a lot of us working in this field, kind of, left this sort of arguments. I mean, because we felt like, talking about population in developing countries, it's like we're going to impose population, the word, the bad word called population control and so on. But it's a sensitive issue. A lot of people, stop talking about it. So for the most part, maybe even when we talk about family planning, we want to talk about the health impacts of family planning and that sort of thing. But I think the point is that in many African countries now, leaders are even recognizing that the numbers issue is a big issue that they need to address. So a lot of the leaders we talk to, the policies actually mention rapid population growth as one of the barriers to development. We actually reviewed about 30 development plans in Africa. And each one of them, not as part of this study, but in each one of them, population growth is really cited as one of the issues that the countries need to address. So in terms of high-level awareness, you can say that it's there. The big question is, why is it that not much action is happening to actually implement programs to address this? So population growth is noted, but there's limited political leadership and financial resources to, for family planning, which is one of the main interventions for addressing this. Of course, there are other interventions. You have to invest in schooling. Family planning can't resolve all the problems to do with population. You have to empower women and so on. But the investments in all these social sectors that would help to actually manage the rapid population growth is very, very weak. I'll show you later that in Kenya there's been some improvement. Malawi is just beginning to warm up now to taking ownership of this issue. But Malawi is even just thinking of providing the budget line for family planning for the first time in the 2013 budget. The other issues are the issue about climate change. Climate change is a new concept in these countries, and I think even in the international development agenda, climate has always been there. These countries have always had effects of climate change. They are agricultural countries. There have been famines in the 70s, in the 80s, and so on. But as a framework, as a development framework, climate change has come up for the most part over the last decade or so. So when we look at the policy framework regarding climate change as an issue, this is just beginning now in these countries. They're just formulating the policies, and I'll get into that. But one thing we note is that when you look at the environmental policies and the climate change strategies that are being developed, they also mention population, but they are not as forthright in highlighting population as much as the population policies are highlighting, the environmental issues. And one thing that everybody we talk to basically accepted is it's important to integrate these issues, but there's very, very limited integration. Why is that so? Those are some of the issues that I'm going to talk about. So I'll just go through some of the highlights that we have in the report, starting with Kenya. Kenya has this development blueprint, the Vision 2030, which basically seeks to transform Kenya into a middle-income country by 2030. And in that document, population is one of the issues that is highlighted, management of the population. They talk about urbanization, they talk about population growth. There's also mention of the demographic dividend there, that we want to, they mention actually the success that the Asian tigers have had. They make reference to the fact that Kenya was more or less similar to the Indonesians, to the Thailands in the 60s, that, part of what part of the main difference when you look at the development trajectory that Kenya has taken is that the fertility has remained high. So all these issues are there, and although climate change was not mentioned in the original Vision 2030, in the 2013 to 2017 medium plan, climate change has been included in it. But I mean, one thing which is also common to Malawi is that in these broader, development plans and so on, these issues are mentioned, but there's really no sort of guidance in terms of how do you bring them together, how do you start integrating them. And then when you move from these broader policies and strategies to go to the sectoral policies are just looking at their own issues, and that's part of the big problem that we have. So if you look at the population and related policies, for instance, for Kenya, Kenya just approved a new population policy in December 2012. They've had, a history of developing population policies. Kenya has been one of the most progressive countries as far as policy making is concerned. Actually, they were the first African country in 69, 67 to approve a population policy. But implementation has been an issue. It was until the late 80s that we started seeing some sort of change in terms of empowering women to use family planning and so on. But what you see is that, the new population policy, the one that we have now for 2012, is the first population policy that has even made reference to climate change. The one that was there before didn't. There are these other, reproductive health policies and so on that also address various issues to do with population. But in general, what you see is that there's very, very weak integration of population in the broader development plans, although it's mentioned there. So it hasn't been a very, very high priority, although in terms of implementation, in terms of resource allocation, although it's been highlighted in these policies. And when you go to the climate change side, you see that there's been an issue. Most of these systems here that you are seeing here have been set up over the last 3, 4, 5 years. The Minister of Environment and Mineral Resources has been designated as the focal point for national environmental matters. It hosts the Climate Change Secretariat. The National Environment and Management Authority, NAPA, has also another climate change unit there. we had this grand coalition government from 2008, which I don't know whether it's fortunately or unfortunately is being dissolved now, with the elections that we just had, that just got concluded in Kenya last week. Now, we had the Prime Minister's office that also had a climate change coordination unit. And Kenya, in a way, was one of the countries that moved further than others, because around the time we're doing this study in area last year, there were desk officers for climate change in various ministries. There are situated desk officers in agriculture and so on. But one of the problems that we found out was that these desk officers, rather than trying to make sure that all the activities in those ministries were paying attention to climate change, people said, they were also just working on their own. So that's part of the issue, and it started going down to the district levels. And as many of you might know, Kenya is undergoing, a devolution process now. There are going to be 47 counties that are going to, so it's going to be decentralized. How climate change will be addressed in all those new governance systems is still, there's still a very, very big question mark there. But what you are seeing here is that there was fragmentation around. People were not sure who is supposed to play what role, who is really in charge of climate change. The people at the Prime Minister's offices were supposed to coordinate interministerial work related to climate change. The people at NAPA feel like because they are environmental people, climate change is an environmental issue. They are the ones who should be coordinating it. So this is one of the issues we saw. Another thing about Kenya being progressive is that Kenya was one of the first countries in Africa to come up with a national climate change response strategy, which was approved in 2010. But this strategy actually didn't make any reference to population issues, despite the fact that population is so closely linked and is so critical for adaptation and resilience issues related to climate change. And I mean, I should also mention, maybe we should have mentioned that at the very beginning. I mean, when we look at the issue of population and climate change, we know there's the mitigation part, there's the adaptation part. Basically, in Africa, in these two countries, when we talk to people about how they look at this, really nobody wants to talk about, the adaptation issue, because everybody feels like, the global warming and all these things, they are mostly being caused by, the high consumption levels in the West. So for us, don't even talk about, family planning or managing population from the perspective of reducing global warming. But at least people recognize that rapid population growth undermines their resilience, that by addressing this, it will help them build their, adaptation capacity. So one of the other issues that we also we noted in this study was that these climate change issues are not harmonized across environment. Because as I said, although climate change as a concept has come up in the more recent period, but there's been a water policy in Kenya, energy policy, policies tackling various issues that are related to climate change. And one of the points that came up was that each of these policies sometimes come up with, policy directions that do not align. And so a lot of people talked about the need to even do an audit of what all these policies are saying, say for water, for energy, for wood fuel and so on. Kenya just approved, actually beginning this year, this was being done around the time that we're disseminating our study, they also developed a climate change action plan for the implementation of the strategy that was done in 2010. And I was just going through this plan. It talks about population. It has a section actually among the priorities that says population and urbanization. But if you look at the text, all it talks about is urbanization. It doesn't even make reference to the issues of population growth and the other issues that you might want to look at. So there's always this, there are all these, sort of discrepancies. When you look at population, which aspect of population is critical? The group that was looking at that mostly looked at this issue, at the urbanization aspect of it. And it's interesting also in Kenya, normally, in policy development, people tend to develop the policy, and then you develop the strategy and the implementation strategy. But Kenya started with the strategy in 2010, and then they developed the action plan, the implementation plan for that. And now Kenya is developing the population, the actual climate change population policy. But this quote here just highlights the issue that people were saying. Without a climate change policy, that fragmentation that you see, different ministries doing different components of climate change and so on, it's hard to address it. Different ministries come up with sometimes the same policies, and sometimes you find that they are conflicting. It's important to have a very, very strong policy framework. But even when you have that policy there, I think the big question is, whose responsibility is it in the government system to make sure that there are integrated approaches at system and at program implementation level? That's a big question mark that I don't think I have an answer to. A lot of people still have questions, because should it be in Ministry of Planning, which has overall sort of planning responsibility? Should it be in environment? If it's situated in environment, a lot of people feel that the other aspects of climate change, like health, like the issues to do with agriculture and so on, may be overlooked. You look at Malawi. So Kenya had that Vision 2030. Malawi had Vision 2020. But one of the key differences between Malawi and Kenya is that while in Kenya, Vision 2030 is really seen as the driver of where the country should go, in Malawi, this Vision 2020 has kind of died off. I mean, in the interviews that we did, actually, nobody was talking about Vision 2020, because Malawi made a funny decision a few years ago that, they started developing what they call the MGDS, Malawi Growth and Development Strategy, which are the 5-year implementation plans, similar to what Kenya also has. But it looks like these 5-year development plans now have kind of repressed this long-term vision. So you don't get to hear about Vision 2020 at all in Malawi. And so the MGDS now, the Malawi Growth and Development Strategy, one was just approved. Actually, the year should be 2012 to 2017. So it also mentions climate change there, and it also mentions population. For the first time, it actually highlights the importance of population in Malawi's development. And just as with the Vision 2030 for Kenya, it talks about integration, that you should integrate these issues. But really the mechanisms of how that gets done, moving from that policy framework to how the ministries function and so on, there's really no proper guidance on that. If you look at the population side in Kenya, again, in Malawi, again you find that they are more explicit talking about environmental issues. The 2013 policy, which was just approved in January by the government in Malawi, didn't even have any reference to climate change until when we disseminated our results, and we then had a resolution there to go to a meeting where they were doing the final revisions of the policy, and they decided to include it in there to make some reference to climate change as a very, very important issue that actually, can compound the effects of population. And the issue of the demographic dividend was also mentioned there. Mostly also, maybe mostly because of the text that we had in our reports. The Kenya is also talking about the demographic dividend. So there's this issue about African countries now, trying to tap up on this demographic dividend bandwagon. But the issue about weak integration, about weak integration of population issues in broader development planning is still an issue. Apart from being mentioned there, to what extent is population actually considered a priority? There's a population unit in Malawi which is situated at the Ministry of Planning, but it's a unit with just 2 people. And in Kenya yet, they have the National Council for Population and Development, which is a fully fledged semi-autonomous organization. So management of these issues in Kenya is at a much, much stronger sort of level than it is in Malawi. When you look at the environmental policies, also water policy, energy policy, and land policy, and so on, it's the same issue that we saw in Kenya, that a lot of these policies mention population. how it's critical that population is a factor in environmental preservation. But they really, in their programming, they really don't go as far beyond that to indicate how their own programs can actually contribute to addressing this. So a good example is when actually my colleague here, Clive, did one of these assessments of the NAPA programs to the National Adaptation Programs of Action that were done. What year was that?
Starting from 2001 until recently approved some in 2008, 2009.
Yeah, so you had the Malawi NAPA highlighting the links between population and climate change. It even, identified investments in reproductive health and family planning as a priority for adaptation to climate change, but it did not propose any specific program that would help address this issue. Like, how do you want to integrate family planning into your adaptation programs and so on? So there's always that disjuncture in terms of having integrated approaches. Malawi is just developing its climate change policy now. At the time that we're doing this study and disseminated these results, there was also no reference to population in the draft that was there. But since then, actually, the people who are drafting the policy asked us at some point to say, oh, we've seen, can we use this sort of text from your report and so on? So I've just seen the revised draft now, and it's highlighting the need for adaptation programs in Malawi to also incorporate issues about empowering couples and women to manage their fertility and so on. Another critical thing about Malawi in terms of climate change is that Malawi has actually set up a ministry last year. It's called the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Management. When we went to disseminate our study, actually the permanent secretary in that ministry was the one who presided over our event. We even went and presented the results to the minister, who was really very, very keen to say, we need to have these integrated approaches. We need to have population highlighted in these issues. So these are some of the pictures we took when we're taking the results to make sure that we don't just present them there. On the left, that was me, Roger Mark, at PAI there, and my colleague were presenting to the vice president, who was then the Minister of Health. And we thought we were just going to have a 5-minute discussion with him. He was even traveling, even said, oh, just come to my house if it's brief. But we ended up talking with him for 1.5 hours. And so he asked us what are the key issues. But what he told us clearly was that, we understand these issues. We understand population is a major problem in Malawi. We understand climate change is one of the biggest things that we have to deal with. And his question was, what should we do? So if you're a researcher or somebody, you get to a high-level government person who gets to ask you the question, what should you do? I don't know what you would say. But because now it's like your research of just, focused on identifying the problems. If you're not going beyond that to look at what are the solutions, then you can get stranded. But I mean, for us, what we're trying to emphasize to him, he actually asked us the question in that audience that, is there any way that you guys can demonstrate in your research that it's okay for us to have a decree like, okay, let's not have, Malawian women shouldn't have more than 2 or 3 children. So I told him, oh, Your Excellency, those days are kind of gone. In 1994, the international community agreed that it's not the duty of governments to tell women how many children to have. Provide them with the information. Those who choose to have fewer children, your responsibility is to make sure that they have the means to manage their fertility. And in Malawi, you already have, 26% of women with unmet need for family planning. If you focus on addressing the supply side, the demand side, factors affecting unmet need, fertility can already go down in Malawi by 1 to 1.5 children. So he was quite happy. But some of the issues also regarding the weaknesses in coordination and so on, he said, can you do some study how other countries are doing this so that we can find ways to address to strengthen our program. So I just want to emphasize that, because sometimes when we look at the African situation, some of us have that past view about, oh, Africa, this continent is not going anywhere and so on. But I think things are changing in Africa. Leaders are getting to a point, they're challenging researchers to say, don't just tell us the problem, tell us also what we can do to address these issues. And we need to be equipped with those potential solutions when we deal with them. So what are when we look at all this evidence, what are the critical barriers that we see for more effective integration? There's, I think, the whole issue about weak integration of sectoral programs. If you have like the water, population, and so on, everybody seems to understand that it's important to integrate these issues, that by integrating, you can actually have better value for money and so on. But there's no mechanism really within the government structures to get these things done. So there are multiple policies and so on. Like for climate change, even if the climate change policy comes up to define how to do this, there'll be the funding issue. If somebody is funded in agriculture to do their own work, how are you going to actually make sure that if you want to bring in climate change, the climate change work is also covered? There's weak coordination of programs. I think I've highlighted that. In Kenya, there's this very, very strong semi-autonomous body. But in Malawi, there's a big issue. But the good thing is that recently, actually, the Malawi government sent a delegation to Kenya to study how the coordination of the population program is done. And they are now exploring mechanisms to strengthen that coordination. So it's a positive thing. Out of some of these research results, governments are trying to take some action. In Malawi, for instance, also one of the issues was that both the climate change and the population coordination bodies were in the Ministry of Planning. But you know what we found out was that even if they were in the same ministry, they were not talking to each other. When we tried to go to the climate change people, they had never had even a meeting to talk with the population people or talk. So everybody just wants to do their own work. How do we start bringing it together? Maybe we can't expect it to start at that level, because even the donors, whether it's in the UN system and so on, it's hard to find UNEP or talk with UNFPA and that sort of thing. So it's a broader issue, but we need to find out how we can start bringing it together. I think the issue about harmonization of policies, I also talked about that. It's one of the issues that is limiting the extent which we can actually enhance integration. The funding issue is very, very critical. Most of these programs, both climate change and population, have mostly depended on external funding. So if they are coming with external funding, the external funding usually comes in silos, vertically, or we are funding family planning, we are doing this. I think the moment governments start putting in their own money, they can maybe start enforcing or promoting integrated approaches within the governments. So there's the funding issue there that is very critical. But also we have to note that countries' progress is being made. Kenya now is funding more than 50% of the family planning commodities, which was not happening anyway before 2005. Malawi is beginning to do that. So countries are moving forward, but the pace is still very, very, very slow. And both of these issues, they are hugely dependent on donors. And another funding aspect is that even in Kenya, where you have these climate change officers, like in agriculture and health and so on, they don't have funding. They just posted there, but they don't have funding really to work within those other ministries. So, yeah, I've mentioned that. I mean, Malawi is changing. After approving this population policy, the president actually has come up. She made the statement that, look at our country. We are a third of what Zambia is, but our population is the same as population of Zambia. She's comparing herself with Mozambique. The issue about Malawi having increased contraceptive use to 46%, yet fertility not declining. I mean, the president has now started speaking about this. And so they are focusing more on long-acting methods and so on. So things are likely to change. I expect that maybe it's part of the lag. One of the big differences between Malawi and Kenya and other African countries where fertility is declining, a bit faster than Malawi, is also investment in education and the extent of teenage pregnancies. Malawi has one of the highest teenage pregnancy rates in actually East-Southern Africa. So that's an issue. I think that this doesn't need to be overemphasized. Fertility can't go down by just focusing on family planning. You have to invest in education. You have to invest in empowerment of girls and women. There's the issue about weak technical capacity that came up. I mean, a lot of people say, oh, climate change has so much money now. Oh, everybody is working on climate change because that's where the money is going. I asked an official in Kenya, you know, you guys are all complaining we don't have money. Yet out there, everybody's saying the money is in climate change. He said it's because we don't have the technical capacity to develop, you know, programs or proposals that can be competitive to bring these monies here. But people are also talking about lack of local technical capacity to analyze data, to translate it, to make sure that policymakers have the data, and so on. So that's an issue that needs to be addressed. So I'll just quickly go through the recommendations here that we have from the report. We are saying that the first recommendation, we need to integrate policies and programs to address climate change and mainstream it more across development sectors. I mean, there's an experience maybe that we can learn from. Gender, the issue about gender started, it was a cross-cutting issue. It may not be where we want it to be, but I think there's been much more progress now in making sure that there's mainstreaming of gender. Can the same thing be done about climate change? Prioritize population and national climate change and development plans. But it's not just putting it in the policies. It needs to be backed up by, you know, allocation of local resources, and also for the international community to allocate resources on these issues and try to promote these integrated approaches if we believe that they can actually make a difference. We need to prioritize meeting women and their partners' needs for family planning. You know, there's the triple win that can accrue from this: reducing poverty, protect natural resources, and reduce inequality, and so on. But as I said, also, it's not just family planning. We have to invest in education. We have to invest in empowerment of women. Improve technical capacity in program design, research, and application. Local capacity, it's very, very, very important. We can't achieve all this by, you know, always depending on, you know, the big US NGOs coming do this, and if the 5-year USAID grant ends, the country is stranded. I think we need to have a much better strategic partnership with local partners so that in the absence of these grants, a lot of this technical work can continue. And we need to incorporate population, reproductive health, and family planning into the global, a lot of the global and regional institutions and frameworks as well. But finally, I want to end on this note that, I mean, when we talk about ensuring that these principles are actually integrated, are incorporated into a lot of the ongoing or upcoming, you know, efforts to change things in Africa and other developing countries. There's this issue about the demographic dividend. I was at the Aspen Institute on Thursday talking about this. The Conference of Ministers of Finance in Africa 2 weeks ago just approved some text that highlights the need for Africa to actually adopt the demographic dividend framework to address its population issues as well as promote socioeconomic development. But you know, one of the issues is that that agenda is being led by economists who don't believe that the environment matters. And actually, I've talked with some of them from Harvard who say, no, I'm not convinced. So the World Bank is doing a study, a 200-page study, but there's no chapter looking at the environment there because this issue is not considered to be critical enough to address this. There's the issue about the PHE, the population, health, and environment networks and frameworks that are being, you know, used across Africa and other developing regions to try to integrate this. Actually, these groups have made much more progress at grassroots level to try to bring these issues together than what is happening at the higher levels of policy and systems. But the problem with only doing it at those low levels without also integrating at policy level is that you're just going to have these fragmented experiments that are not being scaled up. So we need to learn from this. But also the PHE groups don't talk that much about development. So my proposal is maybe let's talk about PHEE or PHED because the D part needs to be emphasized. We need to talk about these integrated approaches also from the development value that they would bring. And finally, you know, there's this whole push about family planning, the FP 2020. A lot of us are still scared to talk about the environment because maybe we think, oh, they think that it's population control and that sort of stuff. But my point is that when we talk about family planning is critical. It has great value for, for women's health, for children's health, but it also has great value for the environment, and it can also help through the demographic dividend sort of a framework to promote economic development. So we need to make sure that we integrate all these issues at all levels. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to thank the Wilson Center, Population Action International, and the African Institute for Development Policy for the opportunity to serve as a panelist today and discuss the results of their research. I've learned a lot, both from reading the papers and also this great presentation, and I'm just going to be very brief so we can open it up to all of you. I think this study tackles a really critical question, and it essentially asks, how should policymakers in sub-Saharan Africa respond to the linkages between population and sustainable development, particularly climate change, to ensure that policies are mutually supportive and are actually more effective? And so there's a lot at stake, actually, if the paper gets it wrong, and governments in sub-Saharan Africa, in the midst of sort of sluggish global growth, move resources and staff to adopt these recommendations. So with that, I thought I would very briefly summarize key points from the paper that I thought were particularly salient for U.S. audience, and then highlight what I see to be the implications of their recommendations for those of us in the room here who are working on these issues from our perch in D.C. So in my view, the study makes an important contribution in two ways. The first is they contribute to the growing body of literature that shows that the rate of population growth and climate impacts matter in shaping the prospects for economic growth and poverty reduction in sub-Saharan Africa, although we all know that institutional settings and policies are key as well. And then marrying those findings with policy recommendations rooted in a very clear understanding of the national agencies and interagency processes that develop and implement those policies. So to integrate climate and family planning strategies, they recommend everything, as we saw and heard, from mainstreaming to prioritizing climate change and population across development sectors and frameworks, and then also augmenting technical capacity in program design, research, and application of research into the decision-making processes. And I think these are all really sensible recommendations. Mainstreaming will clearly have to be part of the solution. Incorporating family planning into sustainable development frameworks makes imminent sense. However, I think the elephant in the room that Elia pointed to is the funding issue, and perhaps to a lesser extent prioritization and bandwidth, given sort of the numerous challenges that policymakers are facing. So if funding is a major obstacle, I think it's worth examining the economic landscape to determine where funds might come from to support these recommendations. And as Elia said, we know that support for climate programs traditionally has come from donors. But with the continuing financial crisis and Eurozone turmoil, governments have tightened their aid budgets, and that's had a direct impact, I think, on some of our ability to augment the programs that we'd really like to see augmented. Development aid fell by 4% in real terms in 2012, and that was after a fall of 2% in 2011. The largest donors by volume sort of remained the same players, but they all lowered their levels, and then we saw huge cuts from Eurozone countries like Spain, Italy, Greece, and Portugal that were hit the worst. Bilateral aid to sub-Saharan Africa fell by about 8% in real terms compared to 2011 and totaled about $26 billion. But the story in sub-Saharan Africa is actually that they've had generally really robust growth despite the weak global economy at around 5%. And their near-term outlook looks fairly favorable. Most low-income countries are projected to continue to grow quite strongly, supported by domestic demand. And however, the outlook is a little bit less favorable for middle-income countries like South Africa that are more integrated into European markets. So to me, this all suggests that in the current climate, and as Elia suggested, that sub-Saharan Africa is going to see reduced aid in the near future, perhaps lower export receipts, remittances, and foreign investment. So the continuity and augmentation of some of these programs is really going to depend on greater budgetary participation by African governments themselves. And then what does this all mean for us in the room? How can we be supportive of our colleagues in sub-Saharan Africa and use our platform here in DC to advance these salient recommendations? And I think in the first instance, we should be thinking creatively about new funding sources. As I understand it, there's always report language that links climate and population in the annual budget, but we haven't seen anything that actually funds that. And so then that leads me to what are the individual funding pots? And we have the population pot and the climate pot. And U.S. support for population programs and reproductive health has actually marginally increased over the last 5 years. It went from $4.4 billion in 2008 to $5.9 billion in 2011, which is the latest data point I could find. So there may be room there. And on the climate side, self-reported U.S. Total, it was about $7.5 billion for the U.S. Fast Start period. But it was mostly directed to the mitigation side. And I think that might be problematic if we tried to capitalize on that pot of money to address some of these issues. Several colleagues, and I, including Cecilia Springer, and some of you in the room are trying to think through these issues, so more on that in the coming months. And I think we should obviously be working to mainstream family planning and climate across our own assistance programs. It's also really incumbent upon us to develop the evidence base that integration on the ground leads to improved outcomes. We need to be testing what works, what doesn't work, helping policymakers in the US and in Africa to adapt their programs based on that knowledge. I'm not saying randomized control trials are the end-all be-all, but it really is incumbent upon us to tell the story and build the evidence base. And then for those of us working on the ground, the research suggested that there wasn't enough understanding of the linkage between population and family planning and climate on the ground. And so for those of us working on the ground, there may be greater opportunity to help communities make those linkages. And that's it. We'd love to hear from you.
Great, thank you. Abigail is correct. We would love to hear from you. So why don't we open the floor to for questions. I do want to point out that my colleagues do have mics, so please do use them and introduce yourself and affiliation. But before we turn it over to the first question, I just wanted to agree with your comment there, Elia, about PHEE or PHED. I know that a lot of thought went into this, predates me joining the Wilson Center, but a lot of thought went into how we name our USAID project. And in fact, we do have a focus piece. If it's not already downstairs, I'll ask a colleague to go grab some for everybody that talks about the need to incorporate the livelihood component into these discussions as well, and acronyms that we use by all means. So now to questions. Who would like to be the first one to pose one? I think we have a question over on this side of the room.
My name is Margaret Noisa. I was former director of the Office of Population and Reproductive Health, now consulting, doing quite a bit of work in Africa still. I had actually a follow-up question to Abigail's comment on the budget level, and I just like a little bit clarification. I heard billion, and I'm not sure what the billion referred to exactly. 4 or 5 billion.
Yes, that was the family planning and reproductive health in the USAID.
Never. That's the global health. No, that's global health. The family planning line item in the global health budget is about 520 million. Yeah. And in the recent omnibus, it was bumped up a bit, but then the sequester bumped it back. So it's more or less the same as it was 2012, which is actually a terrific accomplishment under the circumstances.
Interesting. I wonder if the reporting is different to the OECD DAC. That was the source, but
they'd have to add a lot of things together, and I don't think it would ever add up to 4.5 billion. It would be the global health budget, probably even including PEPFAR. Yeah. So, okay, so that, just to clarify that, because, whoa, would that be a terrific number? Way outdistances any money, I'm sure, going to climate change. But I feel like I've missed a meeting in terms of what the assumptions are regarding the impact of climate change, say, over the next 10, 20, 30 years on Africa, and what the thinking is about the need for African countries, east, west, south, coastal versus others, in terms of response to climate change. I didn't have a clear idea what it was we're trying to respond. I know what it is in our own country in terms of the Hurricane Sandy kinds of things, but I'm not really clear. I know climate's been an issue in Africa for a long time, having lived in the Sahel and the impact of desertification and so forth. But how is climate change and a warming climate now affecting things, and what makes it different, if at all? And then that would help me understand better how these things get integrated. I understand very well, obviously, the population dynamics, which have an impact, but I'm still trying to figure out the climate part. I guess that's a question.
Yeah, probably I would try to try my best to answer. I think a number of countries have come up with studies which are based on budget numbers. For instance, I've seen a number of countries, after doing their budget forecast, revising them later to say that climate change, the GDP, which was supposed to grow, let's say 5.5, we are not able to meet that target. So they had to revise their numbers, let's say by 2 or 1.5 percentage points, and attributing that to climate change. So countries are already seeing the effects even in their GDP growth, and making clear attribution to sloth or reduction of expected GDP to climate change effects.
But is that from drier or wetter or? Are there reports that?
Yes.
As I said, I missed them.
Did you want to add to that? I saw you reach your mic. Ellie.
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of writing on this issue around. In October last year, our institute actually partnered with UC Berkeley in organizing a meeting on the Sahel, where we brought a lot of experts really to look at the how the combined effect of the population dynamics there and the climate change and the projected climate change is likely to affect our lives of people there. And we brought, a multidisciplinary team, people who work on climate change, and there are quite clear projections on how the temperatures will increase in the Sahel and how that might affect health outcomes, rainfall patterns. But in this study, where our main interest was also just trying to understand how the policymakers comprehend the issue of climate change. When we ask simple questions, when you talk about climate change in Kenya and Malawi, what are you really talking about? And people were very, very explicit to say now, the weather has become so erratic. People don't know when to plant, the farmers. And in Malawi, for instance, they are talking about, there were famines before. As you say, climate change has always been there. But there's a general sort of a sense that this is becoming more often. A greater part of the country is being affected. Before you could say maybe 1 or 2 districts were prone. Now it's these countries, you look at Malawi, almost every year they need support, food support, because big areas are affected either due to droughts, but also due to flooding. So the extreme weather patterns basically are quite evident in these countries, and I think there's some sort of evidence to demonstrate these and what sort of impacts they're having.
And I'm evidence of the silo effect. I'm a health person. So I haven't gotten the climate info.
All right.
Nurke, I think we have a question right next to you. Or?
Hi, this is a follow-up. My name is Lorette Kakuza, and I'm with Plan International USA. And it's a follow-up question with regard to the OASIS conference. Has the report come out from that? That was the Berkeley conference.
That's quick, so I can just take it. Yeah, the report has come out. We've actually posted it on our website at AFIDEP. I believe, maybe, I don't know whether UC Berkeley has already done that, but we've posted it because it's more or less out. Yeah, it's out actually. We've posted it for about a month now, but maybe we didn't send it to all the people who participated, and we need to do that. I'll take a note.
Well, stay tuned. We've been trying to feature that report here at the Wilson Center as well. So you might have opportunities to hear further about it here as well. And then we'll go to the other side of the room after.
Hi, my name is Ryan Shelby. I'm a Science Technology Fellow at Millennium Challenge Corporation. And my question relates to the comments about weak technical capacity in some of the countries. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about what do you mean when you say the weak technical capacity, and what are some of your solutions for actually increasing this technical capacity, or as MCC likes to say, increasing country ownership? Whoever wants to take.
I mean, let me take one phase of it. One of the things that you notice is that the government departments that used to unclean environment, even before climate change became a priority issue in development, were already kind of limited in terms of their capacity. You would go to an entire government unit and find maybe there's only one scientist. These are people within the National Environment Management Authorities. So with climate change, these same skills had to be cut across both climate change and environment. And for a long time, environment was also not a priority in national development planning, so it was still being a challenge. There were inherent challenges of capacity in terms of technical skills like education and training, to be able to do vulnerability assessments, to be able to do integrated program design. So when you're talking about integrated programming, they will say, oh, we don't even have anyone within that unit, whether it's NEMA or another unit within the meteorology department. We don't have someone who can do that. So I think the skills range from technical to training to like real infrastructure. You'd go to a Met office and find that there's maybe one or two officers who are running, using some equipment that would need to be upgraded. So their technical skills, their equipment skills, and all the related support to also around decision making and how powerful they are in the decision making structure.
Any potential solutions?
Just mics, please, if you could.
But the second part of the question, any potential solutions to address that?
I think the typical way to tackle that has been capacity building and, of course, retention. Another key thing that I forgot to mention is you need to really also look at the social, the NGO, which, because of training in the public service, would mean shifting of skills to another sector. So capacity building is key in terms of getting the required skills. There is also need to support infrastructure that is needed for the analysis and also for program design and implementation.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just add very, very quickly, Clive has covered most of that. I think the training issue, like you look at Malawi, the College of Agriculture, the university that trains people in agriculture, has actually started a climate change program there. But you know, it's a master's level program, I think that we need to intensify, to enhance those training programs at university level, especially to make sure that you are now beginning to bring out graduates who actually come out with skills that can enable them adopt these integrated approaches. Because if you're just bringing, training economists, demographers, public health people, and they're just coming with their narrow views, that's going to be a problem. So at training level, at college level, we need to start having more integrated programs there. But I think there are these other issues about design of programs, because a lot of people were like, yeah, we know it's important to integrate and so on, but how do you actually start integrating? Especially if you have that limit that up there, the policies are not integrating. There's a limit on how much integration you can do at a lower level. But I think it's capacity building. And in general, you can talk about training. It's about really building the capacity of the local experts in conceptualizing issues, not just coming in to implement an aspect of it and so on. So I think that capacity building, people have to participate in conceptualization, in developing proposals and so on, is very, very critical, as opposed to what tends to happen. Usually, people develop proposals and then they send it to experts in Africa and say, hey, would you like to be part of this? And many of us just jump to the budget page of the proposal to say, have they catered for us? But you haven't been involved in conceptualizing the issue. And if you don't do that, it's just going to be that project and it ends there.
Some questions on this side of the room?
Hi, I'm Kristen Patterson with the Nature Conservancy. I could get you a lot more climate information if you're interested. But also, I wanted to ask you all what, especially for Kenya, I don't know the Malawi context as well, but when you talk to government officials, if you ever think about or talked about the national security angle within Kenya, both of the impacts on vulnerable populations who won't be able to adapt to climate change, and of the increasing population. Because I know there are think tanks in the US that are thinking a lot about, security, and especially in northern Kenya, with increasing droughts and increasing people being more vulnerable. And so I don't know if that's a compelling argument from a government official perspective of a reason to better integrate thinking about climate access to family planning services.
I think it's a valid issue that can be used to promote or enhance the discourse and also program. I am not very sure about its receptivity to top-level government. Of course, if with some good analysis showing the links or relationships between security issues to investments in related activities to elevate it, I think policymakers might be willing to look at it. I think what needs to happen first is to kind of do some background analysis that will kind of show some links, because I know there are a number of some organizations that have done some mapping. I think there's a university in Arizona, Texas, that has been looking at issues of security, both national security and food security in terms of conflict. It's a good framework to look at it, but I haven't seen any micro or macro level analysis apart from that mapping study. I think it's going to be an interesting lens to invest in.
A few more on that side.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Enjoyed it. This is P.V. Sundareshwar. I'm with USAID. I'm a Science and Technology Policy Fellow. My question was about the Kenya devolution. So do you think that presents an opportunity or a challenge for integrating policies? And would you have some ideas, if you were to recommend ways in which integration can be implemented in a devolution kind of a setting, how would that be?
All right, I can take. So devolution in Kenya is like, I mean, whatever development issue you are looking at, it's like the big elephant sort of issue. You look at family planning. I mean, a lot of people are not sure how is this going to filter down. At this point, a decision has been made by the Minister of Health that they'll keep it centralized until the devolved systems, mature, or they are able to take on these responsibilities, because there are dangers that as you devolve governance and new leaders are coming in, some of the critical issues, like whether it's family planning, public health in general, climate change, and so on, may not be taken given the seriousness they deserve, because people will focus on maybe other issues that they may be more visible and that sort of stuff. So the devolution presents both a challenge, because you don't know the capacity of the governments. You have to do a lot of capacity building, to make sure that these the people who are taking over the leadership, the devolved governments, are actually going to to still prioritize important issues for development. But at the same time, it offers an opportunity, because if you have devolved governments and the system is being set up from the scratch now, then you have an opportunity to start doing things from an integrated approach, where you look at the county governance system, where people can be planning together. You can start talking about how you bring population, environment, and so on. So I'm not an expert on that per se, but I think it's a big challenge. There are a lot of big question marks regarding what will happen. And there are a lot of people now coming up with projects to see how you can come in and help the devolved systems of government plan better and implement better and so on. But yeah, there's a lot to be learned through that process.
Yeah, if I may add, I think I totally agree with Elia that there are great opportunities as well as challenges. I mean, one clear challenge is trying to, because every county will be required to develop a county development plan. And I'm sure out of the county development plans, there will be county development implementation plan. So that will be a process in itself to get to the point where now the national levels have kind of looked at the issues and getting the attention might be easier or harder depending on the county itself. And again, the political, the governance structure is also helping in a way that there is also greater participation now. Like there are women representatives in all the counties. There are youth representatives in the county governance and legislature. So I mean, it's a mixed blessing to me. If it doesn't work in the first round of our county development plans, then we can look at following up in subsequent rounds of our development plans, appreciating that the first generation plans might not prioritize some of the issues that everyone will be fighting for.
And do there, and then we'll go over to Jason after.
Oh, thanks. My name is Robert Mertz. I have really no experience in this area at all, but I spent 25 years with a major development institution, and I've just come back from 7 weeks in Southern Africa. I worked on Southern Africa 25 years ago, and what impressed me was the substantial change in terms of governance in many of the countries. Being a graduate of a development institution, I'm aware of capacity building, institution building, shortcomings, and so on in Africa. What I think probably most intrigued me was the absence of political will in certain countries to do certain things, to invest the money in things. And we had a wonderful experience with outsourcing private health care in a particular governorate in Malawi. And I was interested to know to what extent it's possible that if you can get these other things that you've talked about, institutions, capacity building, and so on, it's really the political will. If you're not willing to put money into healthcare or into family planning, there's no real demonstration to an outside development agency, whether it's private sector or government, in times of continuing stress and downward trending budgets. And how can you get the political will from a Joyce Banda or somebody else to really demonstrate the government will put in money on family planning to then elicit from donor governments, international donor institutions, and the private sector locally and internationally to support that.
Ellie, I think you had a specific study at FADEP that looked at political commitment and family planning, correct?
Yeah. So I'm actually presenting a paper at the PA next week looking at the role of political will in captivating or enhancing contraceptive use in 5 countries. So we did this study in Malawi, Rwanda, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. So yeah, you are right. I think political will is a very, very critical aspect of almost everything that we are looking at. If the leaders at the top level are not really, committed to these issues in terms of championing them and providing an enabling environment for programs to be implemented, then you're not going to see much progress. But I think one thing that we found out in our study was that political will actually manifests itself quite differently. You look at a country like Malawi, the 3 countries that have made the most progress in increasing contraceptive use in Africa in the last decade or so, which are Malawi, Ethiopia, and Rwanda, in the last decade. I mean, other countries have made progress before. They all have very, very strong political will. But it's different nature of political will. So you see Rwanda, a case where the president actually it starts from the top level, and at all levels of government everybody is involved. So they champion it, but that still, even for Rwanda, didn't translate into Rwanda putting in a lot of money, because the Rwanda family planning program is still predominantly funded externally. At the time we're doing our study, 80%, was it 85% of the Rwanda program was being funded externally. In Malawi and Ethiopia, the political will was different, because you don't have politicians championing these issues publicly and so on. But I think what they did was that they allowed the ministers of health in these countries to build strong programs. And in all the 3 countries, none of them was putting in a lot of money. I mean, you talk to some of the people I work with, like Salu of Packard Foundation in Ethiopia. He says he doesn't think the Ethiopian government puts any money in family planning. But so what political will does for you is it's a 2-level sort of a process. One, if the leaders are committed to these issues, it allows you to attract the foreign investments on those issues. But it also allows the various players to build the programs that can make a difference. But down the line, if that political will is really very strong, then it has to start translating into those governments putting in their own money. I mean, if you look at Malawi, for instance, a country where 42% of the national budget is actually even externally funded, let alone the funding that is elsewhere. Sometimes when you ask people, put money into this, they might just be moving money from education to this and to that. So in the end, I think that you need to have that commitment that we want to change things here, and that's the starting point. And in many of these countries, like now, Malawi has agreed to create a budget line for family planning starting 2013, and you can build on that. Kenya had one of the most successful family planning programs in Africa, but until 2005, they didn't even have a budget line for family planning commodities. But they started, now they're funding more than half of the commodities that are needed. So I think we have to look at it from that sort of perspective. But I agree with you, without political will, it's very, very hard to achieve much.
Jason has a question on this side.
Thanks. Jason Bremner from Population Reference Bureau. Just a couple of quick comments and then a question. The first, someone asked about how you might, or the process of devolution. And I know in Kenya, PRB works with the NCP, the National Council for Population Development, and they really see this as a priority, reaching county level decision makers and making sure that they understand the role of population in county level development. And they both have staff out at the regional level and are investing in partnership with USAID, investing in going out to district, now soon to be county leaders, and having a dialogue about these issues. And they'll bring together anywhere between 100 and 200 local leaders and really have a discussion about population and development. So that's one of the ways in which even a government mechanism, semi-autonomous, is trying to get ahead of this. The next question is really for Elia and maybe others at USAID here in the room. I know that the OASIS meeting that you mentioned on the Sahel that you were at UC Berkeley, you were really focusing on resilience as kind of I believe resilience as a unifying framing of the challenges in the Sahel. And I wonder if that might be, rather than to come at the intersection of population and climate from the idea of two separate sectors and trying to convince them to work together, is to think about the concept of resilience, which seems within USAID to be getting some traction, and whether or not just broadly that as a development idea might be something that local leaders would understand, and or whether funding mechanisms could start working on resilience as a kind of unifying concept in which you're looking at women's resilience and how family planning plays a role, but you're also looking at many other factors that have to do with climate adaptation. And I guess this goes to Clive too, because you've been working on this as well. And then my final plug is that PRB and World Watch Institute are going to be working together on this issue to assemble an expert working group in which we try to identify some of these policy avenues for increasing funding for work on this connection. So that's a stay tuned that I think we should, over the next months, have some further thinking on this.
I think thanks for your comment. I think the issue of resilience is quite prominent in the OASIS sort of terminology, but we don't quite use it from the perspective you just explained. But I think that would be a very, very useful way of doing it, of looking at it. We actually are looking, we don't just look at these as isolated sort of issues. So there's an emphasis on population, dynamics, population growth mostly, but we're also emphasizing a lot on empowerment of women and education. Because the Sahel, look at it, many of these countries, most of the human capital wastage is on girls getting married at very, very young ages and not having any future, not contributing to they contribute economically to their families and so on, but not to the level that you'd expect. So, and then there's also the issue about agricultural production, livelihoods and so on. So, I think your point about trying to bring it down, to use resilience as a unifying sort of a factor would be very, very helpful for us, and I'll communicate that to all my colleagues that maybe we should put it high up on the framework.
And I think talking about resilience has some appeal to different policymakers and also program people, and it even goes beyond climate. It might not just be resilience to climate change effects. It goes over and beyond resilience to climate. It can be resilience to economic shocks. So I think resilience can be a very broad frame which brings together like a very well integrated concept, and I think it's a concept well worth pursuing.
Speaking of resilience, I failed to mention in my introduction that the Environmental Change and Security Program is now part of an umbrella here at the center. It's the Global Sustainability and Resilience Program. So thought that was appropriate time to mention that. Did we have any more questions from any of the audience members, or any other comments folks wanted to make either on the panel or amongst audience? Well, if not, I do want to encourage you all to continue to have this conversation. You can follow us on Facebook or visit our website at wilsoncenter.org or our blog at newsecuritybeat.org. I want to thank you all for making the discussion.